Hello and welcome to Learners and Learning One. I wanted to give you a brief overview of what a literature review is so that as you start to build your own and progress through Inquiry One, you have a better understanding of the architecture of a lit review. I'm using the slides from Inquiry One so that you're prepared for the rigors of that course so that you can begin thinking about your own lit review in a deeper way and get the foundational setup in my class and then move forward in the next class to add on to it and make it bigger. So, what is a lit review? A lit review is a critical summary of the knowledge relevant to a research question, aka secondary research. It involves critically analyzing a segment of a published body of knowledge through summary, classification, and comparison of prior research studies, reviews of literature, and theoretical articles. As we've seen in our class so far, a lit review can be a paper on its own. We did a standalone lit review last week in class that was self-contained. That was the whole paper. Or more typically, and as you'll see in your dissertation, it could be a preface to a research study, which provides more of a rationale and context and situates the problem of practice in relation to empirical and theoretical work. So we will be doing the second one. You're going to start to build a review that will hopefully situate your problem of practice and set that up for the reader. Purposes of a lit review, you will demonstrate underlying assumptions of your research questions and your orientation to the problem. You'll identify gaps in the current research base and where your study fits. And you'll start to refine your questions by locating them in broader literature and knowledge base. Right now, at this point, you don't need to worry so much about bullets 1 and 3 because we haven't written research questions yet, but you should at least have a broad area of something you want to take a look at and the literature that supports it. For example, one student mentioned looking at online learning. So, online learning as a topic right now is very big. That might be a little bit too big for the purpose of this course's paper. So then I asked, well, can you tell me a little bit about the learners or where they're completing their online learning so we can narrow it down a little bit? And the student described that it was adults and then it was a very specific subpopulation of adults with the online learning. So I had suggested for this paper that the student look at online learning and adult education. That should be enough for this course. And then as you move on, you can build onto it. But to get a foundation in just adult online learning, that's sufficient for this class. And as you'll see with the presentation from the Rutgers libraries, you might search other things like distance learning or continuing education. Those are ways that you can draw on articles that might be relevant, but they might not come up through a search where you're searching for online learning. So again, for right now, you can primarily focus on bullet 2. These other bullets 1 and 3, you'll do an inquiry, but this is just where your work is headed. In this class, it's a mini lit review on a somewhat broader topic than what you'll eventually hone in on later on. A lit review also provides theory and empirical information to specify your hypotheses and theoretical framework. Again, a little early for theory, but it doesn't hurt. You might see a theory in this class that you think might work for a potential study, like cognitive load theory or the cognitive apprenticeship model that we've discussed. So just as you're reading, if you see something, jot it down and maybe take a look at it in the fall. And then the most important part is it provides a larger body of knowledge that you will use to interpret your own results later on in light of theory and past findings and understand what they mean for the field. So that's the end game or the end goal for writing this lit review. When you do a lit review, there's a couple of things to keep in mind as you progress and set it up. There usually is a problem or purpose that you'll specify. You might want to investigate online learning in adult education because it's working or not working, or you want to adapt it to a new scenario or try out an intervention for some subgroup that you want to kind of specify upfront in your introduction. Typically, you'll talk about methodology. Are the studies mostly qualitative or quantitative or mixed methods? And what's the strength and the drawback of the dominant body of research on that topic? When I studied flipped classrooms, a lot of the research was either students' perceptions about it or post-test results where the research was mostly quantitative. So you can make an argument about, we know what students feel about this and we have test data to back it up, but there's so many other things that haven't been explored. Like, what does the group work look like in a flipped classroom? So you would just want to talk about what methodologies have been presented so far, or where there might be a need. Organizing your literature into categories and themes. Like I said, you can group them by a subtopic or a methodology. It's really your choice, and that will become apparent as you start to look at studies and group them based on commonalities. A big component you want to keep in mind as you go through is to explain each theme and cite strengths and weaknesses or limitations of each body of research as it relates to your problem. Now, again, you don't have to have a problem per se right now, but as you critique the literature, you might want to point out weaknesses and strengths that are apparent. And you've done a great job of this with the annotations. Like, these studies were performed in a different country, not the US, or it would have been nice to see the survey instrument, things like that. Or the research is mostly quantitative. It would be helpful to have qualitative. You want to just draw upon these critiques as you go through. That has a place in a literature review, and it's important to update the reader on the strengths and drawbacks of the research base. And then conclusions, specify that at the end. Here's what we know. Here's what we don't know. Here's where we're headed. So again, it goes back to signposting. When you when you complete a lit review, like when you're all done with your inquiry lit review, some things you'll obtain are a theory. You'll have a pretty clear way of seeing, and this is something that takes time to develop. You'll typically draw upon some methods. You might cite surveys or interviews or tests as you go through, or perhaps something longitudinal. So that will become apparent through your lit review. For now, in this class, we're mostly going to focus on context. What is known or unknown about your topic? That's your focus here. These two bullets you'll focus on in inquiry when you start to develop theory in inquiry 1 and methods in inquiry 2. But for now, context is what we're really focusing on. Good lit reviews. Writing lit review is tough. I still struggle with it as a graduate of the program. It involves really synthesizing multiple studies at once. You don't want to just list studies out. That's the biggest drawback. So what you want to do is be sure that you're answering specific questions about the topic. Don't just make it open-ended. It should have a clear purpose. Organize your lit review so that it does answer a broader question, like what is known about online learning in adult education? Or if we're going to be more specific, what is known about video watching behaviors for adults taking distance courses? Things like that. You want to have your literature review answer some broader question. Synthesis, as we've been doing in class, very, very important. You don't want to write a lit review out and say, study A says this, whole paragraph. Study B says that, whole paragraph. Study C says this, whole paragraph. You want to try to draw them together and talk about what's common and what's different, and write sweeping statements that connect the studies together. Illuminate how a topic has been studied. So you might want to trace it through years. Like I know when I studied flipped classroom, I wrote about how it was done in the 90s through reading. Like people would read the book before they came to class, and then they would apply what they learned from the reading in class. But then in the 2000s, when people got the internet, then it turned into videos. And then when we reached the 2010s and beyond, then it became things like Edpuzzle. So you might want to trace your topic over the years and what's been done and how it's evolved. Strengths and weaknesses, again, what do we know, what do we don't know, what's good about it, what's not so good about it, and tell a story. Guide us through chronologically or in a way that makes sense so that the reader who might be unfamiliar with your topic, as I might be when I read some of your reviews, can understand what you're saying and appreciate the critique. It's no surprise, and I'll admit to this too, that when you first start to do this, it's very overwhelming. You start searching for articles, and it might seem almost too much. Where do you begin, and how do you start to develop the framework of a lit review? And I would suggest that the best strategy is to do a concept map if you can. So once you have your minimum of 10 studies, perhaps organize it by concept. There's an article by Maxwell about how a concept is an idea, belief, or assumption held about the phenomenon under study. Every study draws upon a set of concepts that are used in every component of a research study. They are the thread that ties it all together. When you eventually figure out your problem or purpose of your lit review, it might be helpful to draw a diagram where you kind of list out the various theories or constructs that you're taking a look at, or the commonalities and the relationships among them. Here's a good visual of a concept map from a research article. So their broad topic was integrative learning. So the person who wrote the Slit review, when they did their search on the research on integrative learning, they came across three buckets that appeared among the article. So there was this theme or concept of assessment that surfaced in a lot of studies. There was a concept of faculty development, and then there was a concept of curriculum development. And then once the studies were grouped by like a subconcept, then they were grouped even more. So once we look at just the assessment studies, we can further group those into learning skill and attitude outcomes, program outcomes, self-assessment, portfolios. For curriculum development, that branched out into first year experiences, civic engagement, team teaching, etc. So I really believe an outline is really, really helpful, or a drawing like this where you have your studies and you group them by concept. And this will also help for the smaller paper that we do prior to the lit review. Maybe take one of these concepts like assessment and write your synthesis just on that. So it shows that you can synthesize a body of literature. What literature do you include? This is actual footage of me writing literature for Learners and Learning 7 years ago. It's again, it's so overwhelming, but you want to stick to trustworthy journals. Just because it's published doesn't mean it's good. So you want to stick to some really good journals if you can. Um, so to help answer that question, when you pick your articles for inclusion, you can draw upon prior lit reviews, but as the assignment requirements state, we don't want to make that a habit. That those can be beyond the 10 and included, but they should play a very limited role in your lit review. Theoretical and opinion essays can help define questions and how they should be approached, but you really should draw upon empirical studies. These are studies that have a research question, methods, analysis, and conclusions. That should be almost all 10 of your articles. And then again, be really careful about um, the sources that you draw upon. So just because it's published doesn't mean it's good. You want to stick to some of the journals that I suggested, like Journal of Learning Sciences, Educational Psychology, Journal of Problem-Based Learning, something that's vetted and known. There are like more fraudulent journals that will publish anything. So just be really careful when you pull your articles that they do come from a vetted source where the study has been cited a lot. There's a reading on Canvas from Lauer if you're interested, and if you want just the cliff notes of it to determine what's a good study to include and what is not. A good study usually has a question, uses theory. The methods that they use match the question. So if your questions suggest a quantitative method, then the method should also be gaining quantitative data. There should be an indication of reliability and validity, that the study can be replicated if somebody were to pick up the methods and do it themselves, or that the data was triangulated among multiple sources. There should be coherent and explicit chain of reasoning. The participants and the context should be relevant to your own situation. The practice should be relevant, data analysis valid, and conclusions valid and unbiased. And if some of those things aren't met, that can be a critique of the literature that you include in your review. When you go through each article, some questions you might want to ask yourself: should the study be included? And if so, how much should it influence your conclusions? Again, what are the strengths, what are the weaknesses, where does it fit in the broader picture, and what can I take away from it? Some other things to consider: is the study widely cited, and is it published in a respected journal? Only include research that has gone through a stringent review process. Again, that just comes from a reputable journal. Bound your review, so keep it contained in what you're studying. Don't branch off into other topics that might not be immediately relevant. Have a good way to present your literature. And also, and this is important too, you don't want to cherry pick articles or just show one side of the literature. Cover your problem from multiple vantage points. And just a quick example: when I did my research on Flow Classroom, obviously it's something I'm interested in and passionate about, but I can't write the lit review just picking out all the studies that show, hey, this is a great thing. You also have to acknowledge studies that show, hey, this might not be so great. So I included articles about how this didn't work in introductory statistics. This didn't work in large undergraduate freshman courses. You have to acknowledge that what you're trying to say might not work, or there have been studies that don't show a conclusion or something, a significant conclusion or something like that. So just be sure. Or if you're doing something more qualitative, maybe you show study findings through different coding procedures. Once you find your literature, how do you present it? Again, sort by key themes, use signposting, introduce each theme and how it relates to the topic you're talking about, give examples within each theme, and synthesize when doing that. Don't just make a list of study by study. And then explain the main findings of a theme and what is not present in the body of literature. One other side that might be useful to think of a literature review as a data set. Each article is a data point that must be analyzed and organized. Well organized data is synthesized, grouped into themes and categories, as opposed to listing things out in a list format. Author A says, author B says. And just make sure your themes are organized in sequence to deepen an understanding of your topic and problem and where your study fits in relation to literature. I hope this helps. Again, it's a very daunting task at first, but if you can set up a 10-page lit review for my class on a somewhat broad topic, that will serve you really well going into the next couple courses where you can just add on to it and get more specific. Thank you very much.